Hi, welcome to Deep In. My name doesn't matter. Let's dive in. So today we will talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, part 3. Remember, Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been in the United States. He's dealt with the American Jim Crow racism that he saw. His dear friend Frank Fisher has kind of led him through what that looks like and why it's wrong. He has dealt with his good friend John, the Frenchman, who helped him to understand pacifism and kind of embraced pacifism at this point, and he has moved to back to Germany where German nationalism is rising. Hitler's rising to power, and he is watching as Hitler begins to institute the Aryan paragraph and starts to engage the world with his racist ideology and begins to just amass power for himself. And this is troubling for Baltimore as the German pastors seem to be accepting it. Indeed, many of them actually accepted pins that had the Nazi symbol on them, the one that would go on top of the flag, that they had this Nazi symbol on them that they would then wear on their lapels when they were in official church business, because this was the Fuhrer's command to the church pastors and leaders that they had to agree to these things and they had to wear these specific pins. Kind of like if the President of the United States said, if you want to be a pastor who is approved of by the state, then you and allowed to do your job, then you need to wear this particular whatever pin that was on top of it. And they said that would be your approval, and you basically, by wearing this pin, you were agreeing that Nazism was okay and that you were an approval of it and you were an approved state church. And Bonhoeffer rejected that and begins to train confessing church leaders. And when he returns, he starts a radio ministry where he begins to preach on the radio. And as he's preaching, this is around 1931, as he's preaching, he is on the radio preaching this anti-Nazi sermon, and he's teaching about the kingdom of God and telling the Germans they need to reject this ideology, and the radio goes silent. And it cuts off, and he gets cut off, and his production engineer says, "We've been cut off." And what you find out is that later on, he finds out that the Gestapo had actually put a stop to, or they assume the Gestapo had actually put a stop to the production and somehow interrupted the broadcast, cutting off Bonhoeffer and his friend who were trying to preach the gospel across the radio. So he continues to preach. He's teaching at a university, and he continues to preach, calling pastors to stand up against Nazism and to say this is wrong, this is racist, this is awful, and this is not biblical truth. And he's teaching the Bible, and he's engaging people, and he and Martin Niemöller rise up as leaders. Martin Niemöller begins to call people to reject the Fuhrer as the head of the church, saying Jesus Christ is the only head of the church. Bonhoeffer echoes that same thing, and the two of them are two dominant voices on the airways and in the church at large, and they are preaching the gospel clearly and rejecting Nazism outright, and it is making Hitler mad, and he is beginning to respond to them. In particular, at this point, Martin Niemöller is his specific target. So Bonhoeffer begins to openly preach and teach that the church should question the state and its methods, saying that a true church rejects government encroachment on its beliefs. A true church does not allow the government to dictate its beliefs. And so it should question the state at all times and its methods. And understand what Bonhoeffer is doing. He's arguing the superiority of the church and allegiance to the kingdom of God over allegiance to nation, over allegiance to the state. So you could be a resident and a citizen of a country, but you needed to understand that your chief citizenship is in heaven. And likewise today, we need the same thing. We need the same reminder that our chief citizenship is in heaven, and we are residents here, and we are citizens. We make the best citizens because we understand government is given by God for the purpose of justice and dispensing justice. So we vote and we elect leaders, and we call out leaders who are who are good and righteous, and we call out the bad ones, and we, in civil disobedience, go to jail when we are needing to stand up against the government. We don't violently respond. So but we question the state and its actions. We never blindly accept what the state tells us, because the state has a motivation that is not of the kingdom of God. Second, he argues that the church should aid the victims of state action, should always aid the victims of state action. So if state action causes harm to the general populace or the people or a people group, the church should always come to the aid of that people group, recognizing that that is the definition of an oppressed and broken people. So likewise, Bonhoeffer would argue, we have a obligation as the church to take care of victims who are victims of oppression, government oppression in society. So we have an obligation to do that, and that is a very complex debate that we can have somewhere else. You can have it in the comments. I'm probably not going to respond to it, but you can. I just don't do comments. So, but you can have that debate. There are several videos that have that debate. What is Christian, what is not Christian, and so. But when we see an oppressed group of people, a broken group of people who are legitimately oppressed by the government, in this case, in Nazi Germany, literally being rounded up and sent to prison merely because of their belief system, and not because they do anything. So when we see that as a church, it is our obligation to take care of those broken people and to raise them up. Third, he says it is not enough for the church merely to bandage the victims that are under the wheel, but rather we must put a spoke in the wheel itself. In other words, we must stop the wheel from rolling over broken people. Bonhoeffer argued that the church must be active in society, stopping the state from abusing its power. The church is there to stand for righteousness and justice, and the state is there merely to make sure that lawbreakers are punished and justice is enacted. So when the state fails to do this, it's the church's obligation to stop the state by putting a spoke in the wheel. Now, he spoke as a prophet to the German people and spoke out against the Aryan paragraph at this time. And as he's preaching and teaching, he flees to London, he gets hired as a pastor in London. And moves to London, and he meets Bishop George Bell, who would eventually connect him with some government leaders who would hire Bonhoeffer, or who would make Bonhoeffer a spy for the Allied forces. That's right, Bonhoeffer becomes a spy. That's awesome, right? He's like the ninja pastor. Anyway, Bonhoeffer was compelled by God after some time in London to return to Germany, and he, as he's leaving to return to Germany, he calls upon England to stand up against Nazi regime, and he says, if you don't, then you are sinful. Basically, he says it this way. This is his quote. He says, to delay or to fail to make a decision may be more sinful than to make wrong decisions out of faith and love. So his argument is, you can no longer delay. This is too big an issue, and this is going to come to your door. And to delay is equally sinful as making a wrong decision. So he says you must make the decision to enter into conflict with the Nazis and engage and intervene. This is wrong. And so in May of 1934, he comes back and helps draft the Barmen Declaration. And after the Barmen Declaration, which we covered in another video, after the Barmen Declaration, he wages a new kind of war against the Nazis. And this kind of war that he wages it's not a war of fighting or of battles, but it's a spiritual war where he begins to raise up pastors, literally in an underground, not literally, secretly in a secret seminary that's illegal in Finkenwald. He begins to train 24 pastors to preach against the Nazi regime. And he starts to write about justice and truth, and the attack comes in him training these men to stand up against Hitler, hoping to sway popular vote through the church. Anyway, thank you for joining me in the deep end. That's Bonhoeffer's Stand for Justice. This just gives me chills, right? To stand for justice the way Bonhoeffer did. Thank you for joining me in the deep end. Take time to breathe today and go get to work.